first lecture today is by Dr. Kara Cooney, who is Professor of Egyptian Art and Architecture at UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles. However, she's not with us in person this morning or afternoon. She is actually at an airport en route to Egypt to film a National Geographic special production. I think I'm right on the National Geographic part, but Kara can correct me if it's not. Dr. Cooney is chair of the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures. She specializes in the history, in gender studies and economies of the ancient world. She has published many popular books, including The Woman Who Would Be King, about Hatshepsut's rise to power in ancient Egypt, When Women Ruled in ancient Egypt and the modern world, and The Good Kings, Absolute Power and Social History of Ancient Egypt, in ancient Egypt and the modern world. She is working on, actually probably in press already, and they're forthcoming, 2 additional scholarly books, one of which is Recycling for Death, A Social History of Ancient Egypt Through the Coffins of Dynasties 19 through 22. And another book, Ancient Egyptian Society, Challenging Assumptions, Exploring Approaches. That will be published by Routledge. Kara Cooney has also produced a television series that aired on the Discovery Channel. It was entitled Out of Egypt. So this is not her first experience in film production and featuring in those productions. So I welcome today from somewhere in the world en route to Egypt, Dr. Kara Cooney.
Hi everyone, I hope you can see me and hear me. I'll get a thumbs up in the chat, I hope. Okay, good, we're spotlighted. Sorry for being en route. I found a quiet spot where I could. You don't need to know the details. As I told Doug, it would just make him nervous. So let's forget about that. So let's jump into our topic at hand, which is very much about female power, why we fear female power, why we're hostile towards it, and what ancient Egypt could potentially teach us about female power. So as you heard, a lot of my research deals with recycling for death, and I'm currently obsessed with coffin reuse, a late bronze crisis action brought on by all kinds of wood scarcities and trade stoppages and all kinds of issues. The elites who needed to show their place in the world did indeed reuse coffins. And this is me in the Museo Archeologico in Florence, looking at one such 21st dynasty coffin for evidence of reuse. Now, this work is part of my more academic side, and I also publish a number of popular books, which bring me joy and lead me to remember the romantic side of my initial attraction to the ancient world, because I think as many students, particularly grad students, know, you can be enamored with a subject and then grad school can potentially beat it out of you. And these books help to bring me back to the light and make me realize again why I love doing what it is I do. So you have The Woman Who Would Be King here about Hatshepsut, and it really, I tried to write it as a fictional piece in a sense. It's nonfiction, but I tried to get into her heart and mind and soul as much as one can with somebody who's been dead for almost 4,000 years. And then there's When Women Ruled the World, which is really what we're talking about today. It's a discussion of why ancient Egypt allowed such continuous and regularized rule by females as leader of state. And that will be the topic of our discussion. I do have a new book out called The Good Kings, all about absolute power and authoritarianism, which has ruffled more than a few feathers. So if you'd like to see my more strident political side, do The Good Kings. It doesn't disappoint. It's quite a ballsy read. But let's go to a ballsy slide and talk about the patriarchy, male power, the norm. This is what all of us grew up with. This is the system we still live in. Patriarchy does not mean that all men rule. Patriarchy means the fathers rule, a select group of men rule. And here we see such a select group in the United States Congress from a few years ago. And you can see that females are in far between. And even if we look at today's Congress, you will see that females are not representative of half of the population, not even close. The number is still less than 30%. So we can discuss our own hostility towards females in power. And it's funny, my husband was just reading something about people asking when Nancy Pelosi is going to retire, even though Mitch McConnell, who's a couple years older than her, is not, no one's writing articles and op-eds asking when he's going to retire. So misogyny is real, and this discussion of what a female's value is, particularly when she's young or when she moves into a menopausal state. What is our value and why are we often the subjects of great hostility? And how did the Egyptian female leaders deal with this? So that brings us to the topic at hand. And obviously there's much more that I say in my class, Women in Power in the Ancient World at UCLA, which is open for GE credit to anyone in the summer. If you're interested in learning more about what I have to say about women in power, that is a fully online class offered through UCLA, and it gets you a GE credit of writing 2, diversity, and then a social history component. So whatever university you're from, you don't need to matriculate at UCLA to take it in the summer. So it's just a shout out to all the undergrads in the audience. Ancient Egypt allowed women into power regularly and systematically. You don't see this in ancient Greece. You don't see it in ancient Rome. You don't see it in ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Syria. Ancient Persia to some extent, maybe, but not as leaders of state, only as queens married to their kings or mother of their sons who are kings. You see it in China, but again, they're empresses, they're not leader of state. One of the cool things about Egypt is that the women, the 5 women who became king, were named king, not queen. The Egyptians called them king, and so you'll hear me referring to them as female kings as well. Now, the question of why is uppermost in our minds. Why Egypt? Why did they allow this female power, and why not other places? And it might make you think that Egypt is somehow more enlightened, that they have something special going on. But I really like to bring this back to cultural geography and encourage you to look at this map and to think about how Egypt is protected on all 4 sides. Deserts on east and west, Mediterranean Sea to the north, great giant granite boulders blocking the Nile in the south. And because of that, you don't have a lot of invasion from the outside, at least during the Bronze Age. You will see great invasions during the Iron Age, and Egypt will be made a claimed province of many an empire in the Iron Age. But in the Bronze Age, you don't have that invasion. You have a place that's able to sustain 3,000 years of the same language, the same culture, the same religion, the same political system. And it is that continuity that draws us to ancient Egypt. Egypt also has that Nile River flowing through it, which means that you have less competition internally because it's easy to farm on this Nile. You don't have to pray and wait for rain. The Nile floods its banks. If it floods just right, which is usually the case, then you've got fat, juicy kernels of grain within a couple of months. This is a place where people are regularly in the ancient world, drunk and filled with carbs. And so they're not competing against their neighbors. You don't have as much land ownership. You have more institutional land ownership, more sharecroppers in this place. All of those things put together, that lack of competition in particular, means that you will end up with something like this: divine kingship, a continuity so insurmountable in people's minds that it is God-given, it is God-like. And Egypt really perfects this idea of a perfect divine kingship in comparison to any other place in the world, which is another reason I think we're so obsessed with ancient Egypt. This divine kingship of a dynasty lasting for over 200 years, of son following father ad nauseum for forever, creates a status quo interest among the elites, such that if something happened to this king, like say, you know, he's out hunting hippos with the guys, you know, the court's out there doing some manly stuff, and king gets chomped by a hippo and he is no more and he is dead. And it's early, it's before his time. And let's say the king has a 10-year-old son. Who is going to, what country, what place, what nationality, what polity would put a 10-year-old son on the throne and feel like, okay, we can get away with this. This is going to be fine. Let's say you tried to do something like that in ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Syria, ancient Italy, ancient Greece. That kid would be dead before the month was out, and a strong man with an army behind him would come in, hold up the bloody knife and say, ha ha, the kingship is mine. People would say, yeah, it is yours, you got it. But in Egypt, when this happens, the Egyptian elites, the priests, the courtiers, the landowners, the gentry, they seem to gather together in the interest of keeping crisis at bay. And they say, we're going to keep this in the family. We're going to keep this with the 10-year-old. But they don't want the 10-year-old to rule on his own, because 10-year-olds don't make great decisions. I have a 12-year-old at home. I don't let him rule my household. No, no. So instead, you put the highest ranking female into this position. It works brilliantly. The mother of the child is going to be the best. She's going to be the one that can tell the boy, sit up straight and put on your crown and do what I told you. Get back to your hieroglyphs, or whatever it is that a mother can say to her divine son. She's able to keep things going. And yet, as a woman, she can't raise an army. She has no profession. Maybe she's a priestess, but it's not really going to help. And she is, by and large, less of a threat to the male who's in that position. It is in her best interest to raise that child to be a king and to aggrandize her power in so doing. And the Egyptians regularly turned to this queen regent system. And then every now and then, 5 to be exact, one of these women is able to reach the point where she is nothing less than leader of the entire state. She has become a female king. Now, we need to look at how these kinds of things would happen and what the different examples are. But I'd like to leave you with this upsetting point, that we're not talking about feminism. We're talking about patriarchy. And we're not talking about upsetting that patriarchy. Instead, we need to look at ancient Egypt as a means of creating placeholders, connections between one patriarch and another, such that the patriarchal lineage and system can go on. That's what we're talking about. Now, you'll notice that I like to talk about whether this is a queen or a king. We are indeed talking about a female king. And I don't use the word queen purposefully, because the word queen connotes no power for the ancient Egyptians. It meant simply the helpmate or the sexual partner of the king. And the Egyptians use this word. I'm going to use the word as well. So we're going to talk about 5 of these 6 women that I show you here today. 5 of them became king. I won't have time to discuss Tawastret. Her story is one of civil war at the end of the 19th dynasty, and it's too confusing. But let's start with Merneith of Dynasty 1. So it's a pretty cool and extraordinary thing that you see female power rising as soon as the Egyptian state is formed. So as soon as you have something that is a polity under the rule of one man, some sort of a centralized state, that dynasty needs strong females. And this is not the first strong female that we see. There's a dynasty 0 strong female connected to the king Narmer at Hierakonpolis that we could discuss. But we'll start with Merneith of Dynasty 1. And how did she find her place in power? Now, this is a 5,000-year-old story, and it's kind of extraordinary that we can talk about it at all. But talk about it we can, because we have all of these burials from Abydos and from Saqqara that give us all kinds of information. So this is a true archaeological story. This is a story told of tombs and objects found within the tomb, stela and grave markers and things like that. And it's rather extraordinary that you can build up such a human narrative from all of these objects. So this is not Merneith's tomb, as you see here. And for those of you that are interested, Christiane Köhler has the concession to look at her tomb at Abydos, and I'm sure she'll be finding amazing new information about Merneith. But if you look at the right, you see the grave marker, one of 2, we presume, of this not female king, but great queen regent who was buried as a king. She was so confusing to archaeologists that when they first found this tomb and they found this stela, they looked at it and they're like, okay, another king's tomb. We're here at Abydos, the royal cemetery, king's tomb there, king's tomb here. This has got to be a king's tomb. But they looked at it more carefully and they're like, wait, this is missing some things. Indeed, this stela is missing the Horus bird at the top, denoting kingship. And it's missing the palace facade down below denoting the palace, right? Like think of how we in the news say that the White House released a statement today. The White House doesn't talk, but we all know what that means. The ancient Egyptians were arguably the first ones to invent this and talk about the palace. It's where the word pharaoh comes from, though they weren't using that word at this time. Now, when they looked at tiny little labels found within the tomb, they're looking at labels that give us a king list. So when they were trying to figure out the riddle of this stela, they're looking at the king list attached to one of the commodities inside of a tomb. And they look at this king list and they see, okay, here's a lineup of all of these different Horus birds, all of these different kings. And then you see the one with the vulture and the plant next to it. That's the king's mother. And this is Merneith. So this little ivory label is what cracks the code and makes everyone realize, okay, she's the queen regent that's there when there's a crisis within the lineage of the kingship. She's the placeholder that's able to keep it all together. She's not a king, but she's buried like one. Now, to try to understand what her life was like, we need to go back to her father, certainly the king who ruled when she was young, when she was a girl, this man named Chair. And during the reign of Chair, when he died after a very, very long rule, it was a traumatic time. Every time the king died in Dynasty 1, they would bring the elites together and from all we can see, make a selection of who lived and who died, who would be sacrificed to accompany the king into his tomb. There were 587 people sacrificed to accompany Chair into his tomb. Most of the females, according to Ellen Morris's work. Okay, so now we're talking about Merneith as she watched with trauma as all of the courtiers were sacrificed to accompany Chair into death. And she's married to the next king, Jet, as the great royal wife. Now, Jet is the one who dies early. He's the one who creates the crisis. And Merneith is the one who is the queen regent, the one who is the mother of the king who is chosen next. She is sitting there, one assumes, next to the young King Den, who is too young to rule on his own. And he's not making the choice. She is the decision maker. She is the queen regent, and she is the one who decides who lives and who dies. And 328 minimum people were sacrificed to accompany this very early death of a king that really launched Egypt into a time period of crisis. But Merneith keeps it all together. Merneith keeps it all together through this act of sacrifice. Each one of the sacrificial victims gets a room of his or her own. More males are killed in this sacrifice than females, which is an interesting point, also brought up by Ellen Morris, suggestive of trying to tamp down on any sort of competition between themselves and this new king. Each one of the sacrificial victims gets a little stone marker, has their name on it, sometimes their profession. And we don't know the manner of the death of these sacrificial victims. Were they strangled? There's very little marker on their body, except what one of my recent graduate students, Rose Campbell, has been able to determine. And she has shown that on about 20% of the remaining skulls, there is trauma that could be peri-mortem trauma. There's much more work to be done on these bodies, which is why I'm really happy that there's ongoing work in Abydos, and there's bioarchaeological work going on in Abydos to help determine and solve some of these mysteries. Now, here we have a label that could have an active sacrifice in the upper right. There could be some sort of bloodletting going on. It could be something else that's ritual. We actually don't know. But what you can tell from the bodies that were buried is that these were people with good nutrition, well kept, well bred, if you like, and that the Egyptian kings are sacrificing their own to bring them into the next life. Now, when Merneith herself dies, she's set up to get her son on the throne. He's doing quite well. Everything is going wonderfully. When she dies, we're not talking about the transfer of power from one king to another. So we don't need as many sacrificial victims. We only see 120 in this case. The woman is still buried like a king. She is given the burial place at Abydos. She's given a royal marker. All of things are there for her to confuse archaeologists for years to come. Now, an interesting point, and here's her tomb reconstructed, is that just a few generations later, this female queen regent, this woman who kept Egypt strong in its very first dynasty, was removed from the king list in just a few generations. And this is a typical pattern that I want you all to keep in mind, that a woman can rule, can be successful, and yet have no legacy. She is there in the moment. She's not there over the long term. She's just there for a brief moment in time. And then she needs to be swept aside. She can't be there in the history books. So let's move on to our next female king under discussion. We're not going to talk about Neferusobek too long because I want to spend a little bit more time in the remaining minutes, about 15 for Hatshepsut, Nefertiti, and then we'll end it with a tiny little pinch of Cleopatra. But Neferusobek of Dynasty 12 is Egypt's first female king that we have documented. She's the first one that we have marked as king. And how did she get to this place? How did this even happen? Well, her grandfather is Senwosret III, a great and mighty king who pushed against Egypt's elites and won. Her father was Amenemhet III, who really followed in his father's footsteps and was able to make Egypt's empire stronger and larger than it had ever been. And then things seem to peter out, and it's not quite clear what happens. There is another king, Amenemhet IV, we think. Was it Neferusobek's husband? Was it her brother? It's not clear, but it does seem the kingship line peters out completely. That Neferusobek is the only one left, and she is the only one to become king. And I would suggest that this is because so much incest was practiced in the 12th dynasty. And there is documentation of this, that there was no viable candidate left, and we have only a woman to hold this line together. And lest you think that only the ancient Egyptians or the Ptolemies would do something like this, I bring you Charles II of Spain, of the Habsburg family, well known for incest and how successful it is for keeping funds and power in the family. This is something that royal families practice with regularity all the time. So Neferusobek, also called Sobek Nefru, and you can pick either one. We really don't know which is proper. She becomes Egypt's first female king, and you can see her here with the Nemes headdress, the stripes, the same ones that Tutankhamun will have on his mask, and she's got the royal kilt wrapped around her waist. She's not hiding the fact that she's a female. Her breasts are visible. Her dress is even still visible. This is Egypt's first female kingship, and she makes sure to justify it through the rule of her father, not through her dead husband, not through anybody else. One of the reasons we don't know who this Amenemhet IV really is, she's really focusing on Amenemhet III, her father, and saying he gave the rule to me. She's going for a linear succession of power. It's an interesting thing that you see this in politics today, that you can see that women in politics who are part of dynasties get great hostility and pushback when they're trying to be a politician on a peer level, like Hillary Clinton trying to rule with the allowance of Bill Clinton. Great hostility against that. Less hostility against Ivanka ruling with no position under her father, Donald Trump. Within that base, within the Republican side of things, they see that as a right and just way of going about things. They give her an office in the White House, there's no problem. And there's less hostility from the base. It's just an interesting patriarchal pattern to note, and something that is of interest to me. I make more of it in my book, When Women Ruled the World. So Neferusobek, when she dies, the dynasty stops with her. She has no legacy. Just like when Merneith is forgotten, she's removed from the king list. These are women that need to be resuscitated by history. They're not women that the Egyptians kept alive. They're women that they used in the short term and then moved away from. And Hatshepsut is no different. She's our next woman of the 18th dynasty. Hatshepsut was king's daughter, king's sister, king's wife, because she married her own half-brother. I wasn't making up that incest stuff. What she never became was king's mother, because in her short and brief marriage as Egypt's great royal wife to Thutmose II, She only bore a daughter. She didn't bear a son. And so when he died, she found herself in the position of the highest priestess in the land. That was her role, God's wife of Amen. And she has a daughter, no son. Thomas II dies. We don't know exactly of what, but certainly precipitously and before his time. And she's left as a queen regent to a boy who is not her own son. How these decisions were made by the courtiers and the priests, we only have a slight glimpse. We're told that there was an oracle, that Amun-Re was the statuette of Amun-Re, solid gold, something was put into his shrine, put onto a bark, carried aloft by priests, brought out among all of the princes, probably 2 or 3 years old, all of these princes assembled together, and that the oracle chose, Amun-Re chose. And that once one of those candidates was chosen as king, he was crowned. And then we have Hatshepsut brought in as the highest ranking woman of the 18th dynasty family to rule on his behalf. And we have very little information about Thutmose III's, that's this next king, about his mother. His mother, Isis, is very much moved to the side. Now, this woman, once she becomes the queen regent, she's trying to really strategically position herself and do everything right that she can. She puts herself into the position of ruling all of the money, ruling all of the priests, making sure everything is going as it should. She is arguably Egypt's most successful female king. She's not female king yet, though. And here we see her with Senenmut, her chief strategist. And here she's said to not be king, but to have been given the kingship by Amun-Re. It's like Senenmut's a lawyer, and he's writing this for her to show that she has all of this power. So this is from her regency, but you can see she's positioning herself for much, much more. Now, when she finally does become king, and she puts on ram's horns and this great crown on a short masculine type wig, she still shows herself wearing the female dress, but she gets a new cartouche. She's Mat Ka-Ra, and we see this image of her standing before the gods, connecting with him. Now, this doesn't happen, this crowning of a king, until year 7 of her nephew, Thutmose III. And it's an interesting thing that she's crowned at all, because she has all of the power. What's going on? There's a king on the throne. The kid has got to be 9 or 10 years old at this point. Why are we even moving towards a situation in which we have 2 kings on the throne, and in which the senior most king is female and came the second? What is actually going on? Well, I'll make the point here of saying that the ancient Egyptians, they didn't like to talk about drama. This is an authoritarian state. This is a situation in which everything is idealized, and any sort of drama is kept close to the vest, and they don't discuss any of these more worldly dealings. So she's going to not tell us what is actually going on. We have to figure out that some sort of crisis is happening here. And it seems that she's got to take the kingship, because there's no pushback. She rules until her death, and when she's buried in state in the Valley of the Kings. So the courtiers, the priests, the different landholders and elites of Egypt, they want her to be in this position, which makes me think and suspect that there's some sort of pushback from the young king, Thutmose III's family, that's trying to move her and her entourage out of power. People want the status quo. Yeah. Okay, so Hatshepsut, the thing you want to remember is that this woman never rules alone. This is a key feature of female rule within the patriarchy in Egypt. If a woman rules for multiple decades, like Hatshepsut or Cleopatra, she is not ruling alone. And she always has her young nephew following in her footsteps. Now, I'm going to skip some of these pretty quickly. This woman was a jobs creator. She controlled all of the money. She controlled the temple. She brought extraordinary expeditions like of Punt. She showed all of the evidence that her expedition had actually gone and come back from Punt. She created extraordinary structures that we still visit in Egypt today. And yet she could never escape the fact that she was a woman ruling in a patriarchal world. So she starts out depicting herself as a female king, Then she goes down an androgynous path in which she's a little bit of both. And then she fully masculinizes. She's got a masculine jaw, she's got pectoral muscles, she's got biceps, she's got all of these different things. She's got a masculine beard, she's showing herself as a man. And this woman who does everything right, who gives these obelisks to the god Amun-Re, she is indeed buried in state by her nephew Thomas III, who finishes temples for her, does all kinds of things on her behalf to make sure that she is seen as respected. And yet, 20 years after her reign, this woman is erased from every place that she is depicted as king. Her names are carved out, her statues are smashed into tiny bits. So every statue I've shown you thus far has been glued back together from tiny little pieces. They really went after these with a sledgehammer. This is a display, moving Hatshepsut to the side and creating a pure patriarchal lineage that was not marred by any side offshoots of this divine lineage. Now, moving on to the next female king, we see Nefertiti of dynasty 18, an extraordinary thing that you have all of this female rule in the same dynasty. Or maybe it's not, because this was a time when the royal family was incredibly strong. Nefertiti's story is very much being written as we speak. It's being written by Egyptologists like Nicholas Reeves, who is working on identifying whether or not her tomb is Asmenkhare behind the tomb of Tutankhamun's. And I was just quoted in a piece in the New York Times about that. You can check it out. I discussed this more in When Women Ruled the World, and it's a really interesting topic. Now, she was married and was great royal wife to this king Amenhotep IV, the late 18th dynasty. And I only have a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to leave it with Nefertiti because I think it's the only way we can go. And then let's hope when I stop share, you can all ask questions and we're able to do this in some sort of semblance of calm. So Amenhotep IV becomes Akhenaten, who changes Egypt's religion elementally from the top down and imposes this one God structure. Though this is very debated by Egyptologists, I do think that he says it quite clearly that this God is one and only and moves all other gods to the side. He doesn't invent it at the very beginning of his reign. This is a process through his 17-year reign of what monotheism looks like. I write a lot more about this in my recent book, The Good Kings, where I discuss whether or not this is monotheism, how we're meant to understand it, all of these different things. Now, Nefertiti comes along for this wild ride, imposing a religious structure on her people. The move to the new capital, Akhenaten, with these open temples open to the sun, is meant to be the only idol in the ancient Egyptian landscape. Her name changes as she moves from the old capitals of Memphis, Thebes, and Heliopolis, and they move to Akhenaten, and she receives this new name, Neferusobek, Nefertiti. Now, everything seems to be full of extraordinary power, and yet all of this family togetherness can be re-understood and rewritten into a more insidious authoritarian a new place. This king and his great royal wife are co-opting their elite openly, and particularly a military elite with all kinds of treasures and updates in status. And this king, according to the bioarchaeology that's being done in Egypt right now, was very demanding, so much so that people who worked to build his capital of Akhenaten were working malnourished, wounded, in work camp-like conditions. These are discussions we need to have more as Egyptologists. This is a very touchy point in Egyptology right now. Now, Nefertiti, it seems, and there's disagreement about this among Egyptologists, but I would more agree that she became co-king as Ankhepu-Re Neferuaten than not. So we have an interesting situation in which a woman is asked to rule alongside her husband with the patriarchy. And one can wonder why that was the case and how this may have actually worked. But she was asked to rule. And here we have an image with empty cartouches that suggests that we have two kings on the throne at the same time, one male, one female. there's more evidence that goes along with this. So this Ankhepru Re for Neferuaten, I want you to imagine Tutankhamun's mask in your mind's eye, which I think you can all do. And I want you to know that there's a wonderful article out there by Nicholas Reeves that proves, I think, definitively that the name underneath Nekhepru Re, Tutankhamun's throne name, is Ankhepru Re in a longer Amarna-style cartouche. And you can Google this. Look up Nicholas Reeves and the Mask of Tutankhamun, and you'll find it. And the point I want to make, and I'll end with two final points. One, the funerary material of Tutankhamun was reused, all of it, and it was reused from a king named Ankhepru Re. And that Ankhepru Re, from recent research, seems to have been Nefertiti as co-king. What that means, we can determine. But then I'll make this final point, which is that Nefertiti then, it seems, may have become sole king, because the next king that we see after the death of Akhenaten is Ankhepru Re Smenkhare. And this is the king that Nicholas Reeves suggests is buried first and behind the back wall of Tutankhamun. And if that's the case, then we have a lot more archaeological work to do and a lot more digging, but it's a very political point right now. And there was just a big conference in Egypt about Tutankhamun, and that was the point of interest at this conference. So you can keep watching the news for that. And again, check out the New York Times piece about this. And then my final point, coming back to the topic at hand, is that all of these women that you've learned about, and though no, we didn't get to Cleopatra at the end, but each one of them thus far who were successes, who kept things together, tried to keep crisis at bay, women like Hatshepsut, women like Nefertiti after her, Merneith, all the way back in the first dynasty, and Neferusobek of dynasty 12, they all had to become something else. They had to change their identities. They had to masculinize. They had to become a useful placeholder within the patriarchy. And as soon as the patriarchy could, they forgot about them. So these women's names are not names that roll off the tongue. We can barely pronounce the name of Hatshepsut. Most of you don't know who Neferusobek is. And we don't know that Nefertiti is anything more than a beautiful face. Cleopatra is the odd one out. Cleopatra, however, failed. And she failed for everyone to see. She failed in a glorious manner that we can write plays about and write scripts about and have movies. And what starlet is going to play her next? It will be Gal Gadot. Oh, that's a political one. But we love to tell stories about Cleopatra, make her a part of our cultural memory, because it serves the patriarchy to keep up this hostility towards women. And that women, when women rule for a long period of time, they bring crisis with them. And that is why you know the name of Cleopatra and you can't pronounce the name of Hatshepsut. So I'll end it with that. I do apologize for the very many technical difficulties I had while trying to do this on bad Wi-Fi. And hopefully we can save it with a strong Q&A.
Hello, I enjoyed your talk, and I just had a quick question as it relates to how you said they had to transform themselves to be masculine. The ancient Near East as well as Egypt had pretty strong female warrior deities. Did any of them try to embrace that, as far as you can tell, and embrace the feminine with like being a strong leader in that sort of regard? It's
such an interesting thing that you can live in a state like Mesopotamia, or where you have Ishtar, this very fierce female divinity, or you can live in a polity like ancient Greece, a diversified polity, of course, but there you can have Athena and you can have very strong female figures of very often martial power. And those two things do not coincide within cultures. Why that is and how that is very interesting, but it is generally, in my opinion, a co-option of the female divinity that also works very well for patriarchy. In the same way that you can say, I'm on a ship and she is beautiful today, or the United States, she is so strong. You can feminize things. You can feminize ideas like ma'at, truth and justice. You can feminize military strength. And that is, it's an interesting way of claiming and owning it. The other thing I would encourage you to look at is that many of these female more vicious female divinities are either kept away from a partner or are made celibate and don't have a male partner at all. It's like you have to give up your sexuality or your ability to have children to have this kind of fierceness. I would argue that some of the most fierce female divinities are found in cultures where that does not translate in any way within the society below. Now, is that because these goddesses are much older? 10,000, 20,000 years old? We have a very long cultural memory for divinities. They certainly pre-exist civilization, however you understand that. Maybe these goddesses were much older and had to be co-opted in a sense. And so you have a cultural memory of a warrior goddess that gets brought into a patriarchy that then has to be domesticated in a sense. That's possible. But I would also argue that in the case of Athena, that's a patriarchal invention. And Athena comes from Zeus's head. She is of him. She is like of his body and an emanation of his power. So it doesn't always work. But in my class, Women in Power in the Ancient World, it's a regular topic. It's a writing class. So it's a regular research topic for the students because there's no end of avenues one can go down trying to figure this out. You know, how can you have this divinity who male and female worship for her badassery, and yet in society you better stay in the house, stay meek, get veiled, we're gonna have a virginity test, whatever it is, and it does not translate socially. Yeah, it's a great question.
Excellent lecture. My question goes in a similar direction. However, I was wondering, Egypt was on the African continent, and sometimes we forget it, especially when we are across the ocean. How does the culture there and also the role of women compared to societies in that continent with which they might have had contacts, beside the contacts that they had with Mesopotamia and the other more Middle Eastern cultures?
Yeah, for this topic, and I agree with you completely. Egypt is within Africa, and I agree with you completely that we modern researchers generally put Egypt into a Mediterranean context rather than into its African context, and that's highly problematic. To make a better argument between, as you say, a cultural geographic argument of the Northeastern African power, I would encourage you to look at the work of my soon-to-be colleague Solange Ashby, Ashby, who's written extensively on the Kandakes, the female rulers of ancient Kush in modern day Sudan. And there you will see very similar strong women smiting enemies, ruling without a man by their side, keeping the dynasty together. I would say it follows many of the same patterns that we see from ancient Egypt, but it's a similar cultural geography. These are Nilotic structures, and the Nile, while in Egypt, without cataracts blocking the way, and with a limestone bedrock that creates a larger floodplain and a larger population, and thus larger amounts of hoarded grain, you get a more monumental, centralized polity, arguably, in comparison to Kush, which is over its very long history, more decentralized, more diversified, but it's still on the Nile. And while it does have those cataracts blocking its way, it does have the Great Bend, right? That's going to separate it and make things different. And it's got a sandstone bedrock where farming is not as easy. The Nile cuts a deep channel rather than a wide channel. So you can't create that hoarded grain. Yet at the same time, the Nile brings together rather than separates. And in that continuity, you get very similar understandings of a divine kingship and the female needing to be the linchpin to hold the father to the son or the brother to the brother. The Kushite system is very different, and more work is being done on this by Solange, and I'll leave it to her. But more work is being done on how the competitive and more diversified or decentralized Kushite system actually created women who were more in competition with each other, acting on behalf of their sons or brothers. And so I'll say, yeah, it's a depressing reality. This isn't a matriarchy. This isn't women who are creating some feminist, awesome Wonder Woman type land. These are women still existing within a patriarchy, but it is, as you say, intriguing that when you put these two Nilotic ancient civilizations north to south, you see very similar patterns and very different patterns from what you see in the rest of the West Asian and Northern Mediterranean and Eastern Mediterranean world. Yeah, I completely agree.
Move on. After one more question.
Great. Great talk. Thank you very much. I actually bought your book during one of the gaps in Wi-Fi.
That's awesome.
The question might be answered upon reading it, but I was curious about the possible female pharaoh at the end of the Sixth Dynasty that I just don't know much about it. Do you talk about that in your book or?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. I start the book When Women Ruled the World with the mythology of Nitocris as recorded in Merneith and other places, because it's an awesome tale. Her husband's just been killed by all of these backstabbing courtiers, and she invites them all to dinner. And because she's about to be dishonored, I think sexually by one of them, and she has them all killed in a great flood. And it's this whole, wonderful Egyptian story of revenge and female honor and beauty. She's the most beautiful thing ever in the Nitocris, so we understand. And you're like, well, where did this come from? Did Manetho get it out of somewhere, anywhere? The point that I make in the book is that while there is no contemporary evidence at the end of the Sixth Dynasty for a female Nitocris, there is extraordinary evidence, number one, that the story as represented in Manetho hits some key patterns that you see repeated for female rule in ancient Egypt. And number two, that the end of the Sixth Dynasty has regularized strong female rulers. You get, in the reigns of Pepi I and Pepi II, Meren II, you get these strong women who are able to consolidate power towards themselves. So much power did the king's sisters have during the reign of Pepi I that Pepi II is like, I'm done with this. I'm bringing in two new chicks to be my great royal wife, done with the sisters. And those two women ended up creating even more power for themselves. So if you played it right as a great royal wife in a time period of decentralization and crisis, you could indeed bring great power to yourself. And I've written an article recently for Richard Jasnow's Festschrift, Jasnow, and you can find that in academic bookstores. And I think that might be available as an online purchase of an article, but you'll be able to get it in your libraries through JSTOR, I believe. But I've just written, is Nitocris real? Is there some sort of fact behind the mythology? And I think it's definitely something to ask. If these women are purposefully forgotten and wiped from the history books, then there's a reason we may not know about this. But if you look at the end of the Sixth Dynasty, there is some serious female power holding that dynasty together through the reigns of a child. Pepi II was so young when he took the throne that he was able to rule for 60 some years, maybe more, arguably, according to some Egyptian texts. So yeah, great question.